She looked like nobody, faded jeans, quiet eyes, seat 27A. Then both engines died at 30,000 feet. While the cockpit had no answers, she stood up and said 5 words that changed everything: "I've done this before." Stay till the end, you won't believe who she really was. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was a gray October afternoon at a regional airport in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of gray that isn't dramatic, just heavy, low, and endless, the sky pressing down like a lid. Skyline Pacific Flight 227 was scheduled to depart at 3:10 p.m., bound for a coastal city 90 minutes south. It was the kind of route nobody thought twice about. Business people took it every week without a second glance. College kids flew it home for the weekend. Flight attendants worked it so often they could recite the safety briefing in their sleep. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into the familiar rhythm of a short domestic flight. Some pulled out laptops. Some closed their eyes before the plane had even pushed back. A few glanced nervously at the rain streaking the windows, the way people do when weather makes takeoff feel a little less routine than usual. Near the back, in seat 27A, sat a woman in her late 40s. Graying hair, pulled into a low ponytail that had started to loosen somewhere around security. Faded jeans. An old university sweatshirt with a logo cracked from too many washes. She looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a tired traveler heading home. But if you had watched her closely, really closely, you would have noticed something. While everyone around her fidgeted, checked their phones, complained under their breath about the weather, she sat almost unnaturally still. Her hands rested in her lap. Her eyes weren't on a magazine or a screen. They were somewhere else entirely, turned inward, toward a sound only she seemed to be tracking. She was listening to the engines. To everyone else on that plane, engine noise was background, the low, steady hum that meant everything is fine, the kind of sound your brain filters out within the first 5 minutes of a flight. But to her, it was information. It had always been information. It was the language she'd spent the better part of 2 decades learning to read. Her name was Elena Kowalski. And 14 years earlier, before a quiet consulting job and an even quieter life, she had been one of the most experienced test pilots in the country. Nobody on Flight 227 knew that. Not the man beside her, absorbed in a spreadsheet. Not the flight attendants moving briskly through their pre-departure checks. Not the 2 teenagers across the aisle, laughing at something on a phone screen. To all of them, she was simply 27A, quiet, unremarkable, forgettable. That was about to change. The aircraft leveled off at 31,000 feet about 25 minutes into the flight. The engines settled into their long, steady cruise hum, the sound of a routine flight doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Then Elena heard it. A tiny hitch. A fraction of a second stutter in the rhythm of the right engine, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. To anyone else, it would have been nothing, a gust of turbulence, an imagined flicker, the kind of thing you'd dismiss before you'd even finished noticing it. Elena went still in a different way than before. Her jaw tightened. Her hands, which had been loose in her lap, pressed flat against her thighs. She hadn't heard that exact sound in over a decade. But some things, once learned deep enough, never really leave you. 90 seconds later, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain David Reyes. We're showing an indication of a fuel system issue. We're working with air traffic control to divert to the nearest suitable airport as a precaution. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin." Indication. Precaution. Careful words, chosen to keep a cabin calm. Elena heard past them immediately, she heard the strain underneath the practiced evenness of his voice. The cabin heard something too, even without knowing exactly what. Within seconds, the plane changed. A woman too rose up, began to cry quietly. A man pulled out his phone, uselessly searching for a signal at 30,000 feet. 2 teenagers grabbed each other's hands. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with brisk, practiced calm, checking seatbelts, demonstrating brace positions, answering questions with steady voices while their hands moved just slightly faster than usual. Elena stayed motionless. She closed her eyes and began running numbers in her head, not because anyone had asked her to, not because it was her job anymore, but because this was simply what her mind did. Automatic. Like breathing. Regional jet, roughly this weight class, glide ratio somewhere around 16 or 17 to 1 in clean, calm air. That meant for every 1,000 feet of altitude, the aircraft could travel somewhere around 3 miles forward with no engine power at all, in perfect conditions. These were not perfect conditions. Rain. Crosswind. Flaps and gear eventually adding drag. In the real world, that ratio would drop. Maybe 14 to 1. Maybe less. She didn't like the numbers. But she kept working them anyway. She always kept going. 5 minutes later, Captain Reyes came back on the intercom. This time, the calm was gone, not because he'd lost control of himself, but because he'd made the decision that these passengers deserved honesty over comfort. Folks, I need to be straight with you. Every fuel indicator on this aircraft is reading 0. We don't yet know if this is a sensor fault or if it's real. We're treating it as real. If our remaining engine loses power, we become an unpowered glider. We're roughly 20 minutes from the nearest airport with a runway long enough for us. Emergency crews are already being positioned. We are doing everything in our power to bring this aircraft down safely. 3 seconds of total silence. Then the cabin came apart. Somewhere in the back, a child began to wail. Other children joined in, a chain reaction of fear nobody could stop. A man 2 rows ahead of Elena was sick into an air sickness bag, his whole body trembling. A woman shouted at a flight attendant, demanding answers nobody on that plane had the power to give. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Priya, with almost 2 decades in the air, stood at the front of the cabin and raised her voice. Not panicked. Not harsh. Just unshakably firm. Listen to me. Brace position when I tell you. Remove anything sharp from your pockets. Take off your glasses. Find your nearest exit right now, and count the rows between you and it. If the cabin fills with smoke, you'll need to count by touch. We know exactly what we're doing. You can do this. But Elena could see it in Priya's eyes. This wasn't a routine emergency. A total loss of power at cruising altitude was the scenario every aviation professional quietly dreaded and rarely spoke of out loud, the one with no clean second attempt. No fuel meant no go around. If the first approach failed, there would be no climbing back up to try again. No power to correct mistakes. No room for anything to go even slightly wrong. One shot. That was all they would get. The aircraft shuddered, a deep vibration that traveled through every seat, every armrest, every spine. Elena checked her watch. 14 minutes since the first announcement. The remaining engine was still running. That could change at any moment. Around her, the cabin had shifted from screaming panic into something quieter and, in its own way, more frightening, the stillness of people who have begun to accept that something terrible might happen. An elderly woman across the aisle held rosary beads in both hands, lips moving silently. A teenager 4 rows up texted frantically, thumbs shaking. A man in a suit had finally stopped arguing with a flight attendant and simply sat, staring at nothing. Elena ran the numbers one more time. If the second engine failed right now, this instant, they had somewhere between 12 and 15 miles of glide range in these conditions. The airport was close to that distance. The margin was razor thin, the kind of thin where a single gust at exactly the wrong moment could be the difference between everyone walking away and no one walking away at all. Then the second engine began to fail. Not a bang. Not an explosion. Just a change in pitch, a slow, terrible unwinding. That was when Elena made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood. She didn't look around, didn't hesitate, she simply rose and began walking toward the front of the cabin with a calm, deliberate purpose that looked entirely out of place among the fear surrounding her. A flight attendant named Sophia stepped in front of her before she'd taken 2 steps. "Ma'am, you need to sit down and buckle in. We're in an emergency." "I need to speak to the captain," Elena said. Her voice was quiet, and completely level. "I have information that can help. Every second matters." "Ma'am, our pilots are trained professionals, they're handling." "I'm a former experimental test pilot," Elena said. "I've flown 14 unpowered, engines out landings from cruising altitude during flight test programs. I know techniques that could change the outcome here. Please." Sophia stared at her for a long moment. Something in her expression cracked, the automatic resistance giving way to something that looked almost like desperate hope. She turned and called out. "Priya, you need to hear this." Priya arrived quickly, her eyes sharp with the practiced skepticism of someone who had spent 2 decades managing panicked passengers who thought they had answers. She studied Elena carefully. "Ma'am, I understand you're frightened, but disrupting them." "I'm not frightened," Elena said. And there was something in the way she said it, so still, so certain, that Priya stopped mid-sentence. "My name is Elena Kowalski. I spent 12 years as an experimental test pilot. I worked on unpowered descent and dead-stick landing procedures for aircraft very close to this one. I've executed 14 full engines-out landings from altitude under controlled test conditions. I helped write some of the emergency procedures your pilots are using right now. I need to be in that cockpit." Priya studied her for one more heartbeat. The aircraft shuddered again, rougher this time. Everyone in the cabin felt it. "What's the estimated glide ratio of this aircraft class in clean configuration?" Priya asked. "Roughly 17 to 1 in ideal conditions," Elena answered without pause. "In this weather, with asymmetric drag from a failing engine and rain resistance, closer to 14 or 15 to 1. At our current altitude, I'd estimate around 9,000 feet, if the second engine fails completely right now, we have roughly 10 to 12 miles of glide range before we're on the ground, one way or another." Priya picked up the interphone. "Captain, there's a passenger up here who needs to come to the flight deck. She says she's a test pilot with experience in engines-out emergencies." The captain's voice came back, tight and fast. "Priya, we don't have time for." She just quoted our glide ratio and altitude with more precision than I could make up on the spot. "I think you need to hear her. Right now." A pause. It felt endless. "Send her up." Elena moved to the front of the cabin, aware of every pair of eyes following her. The cockpit door opened, and she stepped inside. The flight deck was lit by the cold glow of instrument panels and warning lights, screen after screen quietly telling the story of how bad things had become. Captain David Reyes was a man in his 50s, silver threading through dark hair, his hands locked on the controls, his eyes fixed forward. His first officer, younger, maybe mid-30s, worked the radio with one hand and managed what remained of the engine controls with the other. "You have 30 seconds, Reyes said without turning. "We're roughly 7 minutes out with one engine about to fail completely. Talk." Elena's eyes moved across the instruments, altitude, airspeed, descent rate, position on the navigation display. In a single glance she absorbed the approach they'd already planned. It was good. Professional. By the book. But there was more to consider. There was always more, when you'd lived through this exact nightmare over and over in conditions built specifically to teach you what the books couldn't. She looked at the captain. "I've done this before." 5 words. Simple. Direct. Unshakably certain. The captain's hand stilled on the controls for half a second. The first officer turned and looked at her, really looked, for the first time. The cockpit fell silent except for the labored cough of the dying engine and the low static of radio chatter. My name is Elena Kowalski, she said. 12 years as an experimental test pilot. I've executed 14 complete engines-out landings from cruising altitude during certification and flight test work. I know what works in a simulator. I also know what works when you're actually there, with no power, no second attempt, and real lives depending on the outcome. Let me help you optimize this approach. Reyes's expression moved through disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked like a man making the most important decision of his career. 14 times, he said slowly. You've actually done this 14 times. 14 times. Different aircraft, different weights, different weather. I know the physics. I know exactly which adjustments matter when there's no power left to correct for mistakes. The remaining engine coughed again, RPM dropping visibly on the gauge. 5 minutes to the runway, the first officer said, voice tight. Reyes made his decision. Hayes, give her your seat. Stay on the radio, but let her advise the approach. If she doesn't know what she's talking about, we'll know within 30 seconds. Hayes didn't argue. He unbuckled and slid out without a word. Elena took his seat, and years of muscle memory returned instantly, as though she had never left it behind. Your plan is textbook for a normal approach, Elena said, scanning the instruments. But for a dead stick landing, there are adjustments that matter more than anything in the manual. You're at 152 knots right now. That's burning glide range you can't afford to lose. You need exactly 138 knots, best glide speed for this aircraft at this weight. If I slow down now, I risk a stall the moment we lose the second engine and hydraulic assist, Reyes said. Trust the physics, Elena said. I've tested this 14 times. At 138 knots you get maximum lift to drag ratio. Slowing down now actually extends your range. The numbers don't lie. Reyes hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he began bleeding off speed, easing back on the remaining throttle, raising the nose a fraction. Elena watched the instruments as their speed settled toward target. The descent rate dropped from nearly 800 feet per minute to just over 600. They were losing altitude more slowly. They were buying time that, at this altitude, was the only currency that mattered. Tell the tower to stage emergency vehicles at the approach end of the runway, Elena said to Hayes. Not midfield. The approach end. If we come up even 100 feet short, we want them right there. Tell them to expect complete power loss within the next 3 to 4 minutes. Hayes relayed the message. The tower's response came back fast, clipped, and precise, the voice on the other end clearly understanding exactly what was at stake. Then the second engine shuddered violently. Reyes's hand moved instinctively toward the throttle, trying to coax a few more seconds of thrust out of it. Let it die clean, Elena said firmly. Don't try to save it. When it flames out, the fan will keep windmilling in the airflow, it won't give you thrust, only drag. The second it stops producing power, we accept it and optimize everything else around the glide. There's no more fuel, Elena said, gently but without a trace of doubt. Accept that. Optimize for the glide. That's the only path forward from here. For minutes from the runway, the second engine gave one final rough shudder and died completely. The cabin lights flickered as the aircraft's systems shifted to backup power. Behind the closed cockpit door, Elena could hear the muffled sound of passengers gasping, someone crying out, and beneath it all, Priya's voice, steady, calm, relentless, talking people through the fear. Portland, sorry, Tower, Hayes corrected himself, voice tight with adrenaline, Skyline 227, complete loss of power, unpowered glide, 3 minutes from the runway. Request all emergency equipment and a clear approach. Skyline 227, you are cleared. All other traffic is holding. Emergency vehicles deployed. Wind is light and variable. Runway is clear. Good luck. Elena studied the weather radar. A rain cell sat squarely across their approach path, roughly 5 miles out. "That cell is going to hit us," she said. "There's likely a downdraft inside it. We'll lose altitude faster than our glide ratio predicts, maybe by half again as much. But the air clears on the other side. So here's what we do, we fly a slightly shallower path right now, build a small altitude buffer. We accept the steeper descent through the rain, because we've built in the margin for it. Then we flatten out again on the far side for the final approach. If I raise the nose now, my airspeed drops below target," Reyes said. "I risk a stall." "Trust the physics," Elena said again. "I've done this. In 2 minutes, when we hit that cell, we'll be at roughly 4,500 feet instead of the standard 4,000. That extra buffer is what saves us when the downdraft hits." Reyes complied, easing the nose up slightly. The vertical speed indicator showed the shallower descent taking hold. 2 minutes later, they entered the rain. The descent rate spiked instantly. Rain hammered the windshield with a sound like gravel thrown against glass. Visibility collapsed to almost nothing. The aircraft bucked hard in the turbulence, thrown by forces the crew had no engine power left to fight. "Passing through 3,000 feet, Hayes reported, voice strained. "Descent rate climbing. We're going to come up short." "No," Elena said, eyes locked on the instruments. "Watch what happens when we clear the cell." 10 more seconds. 10 seconds later, they broke through the rain into clear air. Immediately the descent rate eased, the turbulence faded, the aircraft steadied beneath them. 2,000 feet, Hayes said, and there was something new in his voice now, something cautious, almost disbelieving. 5 miles from the threshold. Through the windshield, the runway came into view, a pale gray strip in the distance, growing slowly larger, lined on either side by the flashing red and blue lights of waiting emergency vehicles. "Now we convert altitude into speed," Elena said. "Lower the nose slightly. Let us build to around 148 knots, we'll need that energy for the flare." Reyes eased the yoke forward. Airspeed climbed. Elena watched the runway grow steadily in the windshield, tracking their approach angle, their alignment, every needle on every gauge. "Gear down," she said. "It'll cost us drag and altitude fast, but we have the energy budget for it now, and we need to be in landing configuration before we're too low to fix anything. Gear down, now." The landing gear extended. Green lights blinked on one by one. The descent rate increased exactly as she had calculated. 1,000 feet, Hayes called. 2 miles out. A pause. "We're going to make it. We're actually going to make it." "Don't celebrate yet," Elena said quietly. "This is where it gets technical. Too high, and we run off the far end. Too low, and we come up short. From here the margin is measured in feet, not miles. 500 feet. 1 mile. Flaps, Elena said. Reyes deployed them, and the descent rate eased as the added lift took hold. The runway filled the windshield now. Elena could make out individual markings on the wet concrete, could see puddles pooling in the low spots, could see the shapes of emergency crews standing beside their vehicles, watching, waiting. "We're going to land long," Reyes said. "Should I steepen it?" "No. We're exactly on profile. This just looks different because you're used to a powered approach. Trust it." 200 feet. The runway threshold slid beneath them. The approach lights flashed past below the nose. "Not yet," Elena murmured, watching the altimeter unwind. "Let her settle. Wait for it. 100 feet. Gentle flare. Don't over-control. Let the aircraft settle into ground effect." Reyes pulled back smoothly on the yoke. The nose rose. The descent slowed as the wings found a thin cushion of compressed air between them and the runway. Airspeed bled through 120 knots. 115. 110. 50 feet. 20. 10. The main gear touched down with a sharp chirp of rubber on wet pavement. Reyes deployed the spoilers instantly, killing the remaining lift, planting the aircraft firmly onto the runway. The nose gear settled a moment later with a solid, grounding thump. No reverse thrust. No engines to help slow them. Just brakes and the anti-skid system fighting to keep the wheels from locking on the wet surface. The aircraft decelerated. Spray flew up from the tires in 2 white arcs. Distance markers flashed past, 3,000 feet remaining, 2,000, 1,000. They rolled to a stop with just under 800 feet of runway left. For one long moment, the cockpit was utterly silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were rain against the fuselage and the distant wail of sirens closing in. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within moments, foam trucks and ambulances positioning on either side, though, remarkably, none of them would be needed for anything more than precaution. Every one of the 158 passengers and 6 crew members walked off that runway on their own 2 feet. Captain Reyes found Elena on the tarmac afterward, both of them soaked from the rain, neither quite able to process what had just happened. "That flight," he said slowly, "changed how I'll see every single person sitting in my cabin from now on. You were dressed like anyone else. Middle of coach seat. Nothing about you suggested you were carrying that kind of history. And I had no idea, not until the exact moment we needed it." "That's true of more people than you'd think," Elena said. "The person next to you on any flight might be a trauma surgeon. The quiet one in the back might be a combat medic who knows exactly how to stay calm when everything falls apart. We all carry our histories invisibly, until the moment something calls them forward." Reyes nodded slowly. "I used to walk through the cabin before a flight and just see passengers. People to move from one city to another. I don't think I'll ever see it that simply again." Elena went back to her quiet consulting work not long after. Back to being unremarkable in the aviation world that had once been her entire life. Back to a life that, from the outside, looked completely ordinary. But she wasn't quite the same. And neither were the 158 people who had been aboard Flight 227 that gray October afternoon. In the weeks that followed, investigators from the Transportation Safety Board pieced together what had actually happened on Flight 227. It turned out to be almost mundane in its cause. A faulty fuel quantity sensor had been feeding the cockpit displays inaccurate readings for most of the flight, masking a slow, real fuel loss caused by a failed transfer valve between tanks. By the time the crew realized the numbers on their screens weren't measurement errors but the truth, there had been almost nothing left to work with. It was the kind of failure that looked simple on paper and had come within a few hundred feet of being catastrophic in the air. None of that made the 22 minutes between the first announcement and the wheels touching down any less extraordinary. The investigators interviewed Captain Reyes for nearly 6 hours. They interviewed First Officer Hayes. They interviewed Priya and Sophia and a dozen passengers who had been close enough to the front of the cabin to see what happened. And they interviewed Elena Kowalski, who answered every question plainly, without embellishment, the way she'd answered questions in flight test debriefs for over a decade. "I didn't do anything superhuman," she told them, more than once. "I just happened to already know the answer to a question this crew had never been asked before." The report that came out months later credited the survival of everyone aboard Flight 227 to what it called exceptional crew resource management under extreme circumstances, a dry, technical phrase that could never fully capture what it had actually felt like inside that cockpit. Buried in an appendix, almost as a footnote, was an acknowledgement that a passenger with prior experimental test pilot experience had, at the captain's discretion, provided technical input during the final approach, and that this input had been consistent with established best practices for unpowered descent profiles. It was a careful, bureaucratic way of saying, "A stranger saved this airplane," and the official record almost didn't know how to say so. Reporters found Elena anyway. They always do. For a week or two, her name appeared in headlines she never asked for, "The Woman in 27A," one outlet called her, as if the seat number alone was enough to tell the whole story. She gave a handful of interviews, always brief, always understated, always steering the conversation back toward the crew who had trusted her, the flight attendants who had kept a terrified cabin from tipping into chaos, the ground crews who had been ready and waiting the moment the wheels touched down. She never once described herself as a hero. When a young reporter finally asked her directly whether she felt like one, she was quiet for a moment before answering. "A hero is someone who runs toward danger they didn't have to face," she said. "I didn't run toward anything. I was already on that plane. I just happened to be the only person on it who knew what to do next. That's not heroism. That's just what happens when the right kind of preparation meets the wrong kind of day." Within a month, the story had mostly faded from the news cycle, the way these things always do, replaced by the next headline, the next crisis, the next thing demanding the public's fractured attention. Elena went back to the life she built after leaving flight test work, small consulting projects, long mornings with coffee and silence, the occasional lecture to aviation engineering students who had no idea, until someone told them, that the calm woman at the podium had once talked a captain through a dead stick landing at 30,000 feet. But something had shifted, quietly, in the way people who'd been on that flight moved through the rest of their lives. Priya requested to keep flying instead of transitioning to a ground role, the way she'd been planning to before that October afternoon. She said she wanted to be the kind of flight attendant who could hold a cabin together the way she had that day, on purpose, not by accident. Hayes eventually became a captain himself, and colleagues said he had a habit, before every flight, of walking the aisle and looking, really looking, at the faces of the passengers boarding, as if trying to guess which of them might be carrying something the rest of the world couldn't see. And Captain Reyes kept a single memento from that flight in his flight bag for the rest of his career, a boarding pass stub for seat 27A, folded once, tucked into an inside pocket where he could feel it whenever he reached for his logbook. He never explained it to anyone who asked. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it meant, and that was enough. Sometimes, late at night, Elena found herself thinking about those 5 words, about how the simplest sentence can carry the most weight a person will ever say. About how real experience isn't only knowledge gathered over years. It's the confidence to act without hesitation the moment hesitation would cost everything. She thought about sitting quietly in 27A, looking like any tired traveler in an old sweatshirt, carrying a history nobody around her could see. About how everyone, in some way, is carrying something like that, expertise forged in moments no one else ever witnessed, invisible until the world suddenly needs it. 14 times, she had learned how to bring a powerless aircraft down safely, in controlled conditions, where every variable was measured, and the worst possible outcome was simply data. And then, once, it wasn't a test. It was 158 real people, with real families waiting for them somewhere on the ground, and everything depending on whether the numbers held and the physics worked, and one quiet woman in the back of the plane decided, without hesitation, to stand up. She stood up. The numbers held. And everyone went home. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can be is the one who has done this before, when no one else in the room has. And sometimes, against every possible probability, that person is sitting only a few rows away from you, invisible, until the moment the world needs them to be extraordinary.